In a world where even the smallest disagreement can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects, the ones that we are told to avoid in polite conversation. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It is also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear another person's head off and vomiting down the bloody stump of their neck. Today, we're going to discuss the cognitive biases, in particular the ones that have an impact on political conversation, since that tends to be where you and I spend a good portion of our conversations. And of course, if there's another or particular cognitive bias that we don't cover, if you want to bring it up, you're welcome to throw it out there. Did you get a chance to look over the link that I sent you?
Which one was that?
It was the 11 cognitive biases that influence political outcomes.
No, I didn't.
Oh dear. Okay, well, let me pull it up right now.
I mean, I do know a fair amount about cognitive biases, like confirmation bias and other ones.
Yep. Yeah. And as you can see on the list, and for those that are listening to this in the audio version, I'll put a link to it on the website because it's a pretty useful bit of information and a very concise, I guess, analysis of them. And I think it's particularly helpful that we're not looking at these from a very broad psychological perspective or philosophical, more looking at them and how they, I guess, impact our personal beliefs and also our conversations with other people when we're dealing with some of these difficult topics that you and I tend to cover frequently. And the first one on the list is the confirmation bias, which I think I think of all the biases that I've run across, I think it's probably the most common, or maybe just the most common in the topics that I cover. Because once we start to get an idea of something, start to form an opinion, we tend to, as a population, look for things that will confirm that opinion. I was looking at something else, and it occurred to me that when we get into a certain mindset where we're just saying, okay, teach me something. You go and you meet someone, let's say that they're particularly passionate or knowledgeable on vintage Porsches. Okay, I know nothing about vintage Porsches, and I'm mildly curious, so I'll just sit there and absorb whatever it is this person can tell me. I don't have an opinion on it. But if I get into the conversation with someone, and if I had an opinion, and this person I'm talking to starts to tell me, well, one of the better Porsches of, it would be the 1956 blah 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 Speedster, Boxster, whatever that is that they do, and I have an opinion of my own, I might start to get argumentative, and I feel like the more we have learned about a subject, the more likely we are to be reluctant to change our opinion. You found similar, different? What do you think?
No, I think that's definitely true. There's an investment both in the sense that you've told people, for example, that you're a Republican or that you believe something, that a certain Porsche is the best one or something like that. To go and change it, people almost look at that as dishonest or weak. You want to confirm what you believe because you're kind of entrenched in it. You've paid your dues, you've researched a lot, you've talked with a lot of people about it. So it's hard to change those, I think, is certainly true. And every time, if you have a particular viewpoint, when you read an article, everything in that article that agrees with your viewpoint stands out as true, and everything that that kind of disagrees or disproves your viewpoint, you might find a reason to undercut it or explain why it's not that important of a piece of data.
Yeah, I would agree. And I like the use that you brought up, the use of the word investment. When we have a time investment into something, the more we've invested, whether it's time, whether it's money, emotion, whatever it might be, the more we've put into it, the more reluctant we are to leave that perspective. Yeah. The second one was on this list is the coverage bias, and that's the extent to which different issues are reported on and discussed. And this is one that it happens more, it's more of an external bias, I think. Maybe there's ways that it happens internally, but it's more, from what I could gather from it, it's more the framing of topics around each other and how we phrase them will create a bias. So maybe it's internal when we're presenting the idea to somebody else, but more, when we're receiving information, it's more of an external. So that the example they give in this particular article is a media organization is talking about the increases in the budget for the Defense Department, and then they follow that immediately with the deficit of the government, and so those two, it's easy for the listener then to link those two.
Yeah, I would say, a couple of other examples. A couple of examples that we see all the time. Shark attacks are very, very rare, but when they happen, they're really covered in the media. So people think that it's really dangerous to go swimming in the ocean because they might get attacked by a shark, which is less likely than getting struck by lightning. Or another manifestation I've seen is you have this idea about the people in this country maybe feel a certain way because they're overrepresented and very vocal on social media, or there's more coverage of those people in the news from the news organizations. So we have this idea of a very skewed idea of what people think because we're hearing a large group of a loud group, maybe it's a small group of people, but a loud group of people, whether loud because they're just making a lot of noise and posting a lot, or because they're being covered more by the news organizations. We think, for example, that, just as an example, we might get an idea of what certain Trump supporters are like. And that might be because the news media is focusing on those types of supporters. Or looking at the Democratic Party, somebody might say, well, the Democratic Party all thinks this, but it's only those people that are receiving coverage from the news media. If that makes it clear.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Whenever there's a hot topic, it's not so much that the party, either party, chooses a spokesperson, but there tends to be a soundbite that's associated with that hot topic, and maybe a few representatives, get their soundbite on, and then the assumption is, well, this must represent the majority of people in Congress of that party, or the majority of the party within that country. And it's easy to fall into the belief. And this particularly happens when we hear it from the opposite side, from the opponents. When an opponent says, someone in the parties, Marjorie Taylor Greene says something crazy, which is often, oh, that must be the how the Republicans feel. And of course, if I were a Republican, I would not want to be put into that same category of her perspective or mindset.
Yeah, it's almost, I don't know if we're going to cover this one, but there's the straw man argument that you build up the other side of the person that you're arguing against. You build up their point of view into something that it isn't. And so, for example, and then you attack that, and they're left saying like, no, so for example, if somebody's attacking, the Republicans, and they say, well, look, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she said this stuff, that's what Republicans believe. Yeah, that's a straw man argument that I think, and that often happens with this coverage bias because it's really exciting to hear somebody who's going to say something outlandish, a Donald Trump, a Marjorie Taylor Greene, somebody who's loud and has kind of outlandish ideas. To cover that is much more interesting and maybe gets more views than covering somebody that's just run of the mill of the road.
Yeah. And on the other side, when you hear someone that represents your viewpoint, but doing it in a really crazy, aggressive way, or offensive, or hitting topics you don't appreciate, there's always that cringe going, oh, I wish they found someone a little more reasoned to go and interview. But of course, who wants a reasoned interviewee? You want the crazy loudmouth.
It seems like always the case when you see libertarian candidates for president.
Yeah.
Well, that's the guy we're going with. He's a little over the top.
Oh, yeah. All right, so the next one is the concision bias, and I had a little trouble with this one, but if you see within it the word concise, and the idea is that you select bits of information to represent the viewpoint. And again, this sort of comes back to what we were just saying about having an individual represent an entire group of people. And except in this case, we look at maybe a bullet point or a soundbite or something else, and now we've distilled the topic down to something small. A big time that this is used in a manipulated way is when you have these acts, legislation running through the government, and they give it a name that is not vaguely or not at all representative of what's actually happening within the bill, as a way to try and, I guess, fool people into thinking it's doing one thing when it does something else.
Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act, which didn't reduce inflation.
Yeah, it was a very. I'm not quite sure where they got the Inflation Reduction out of all the things that were in that bill. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Moving down the list, the authority bias, and this is one that's got a particularly interesting example in the news these days, and that is the idea is that someone with authority speaking on something, and we give it more value because of that person's authority. And it seems like, if I'm understanding it correctly, someone with authority, but not in the subject matter that we're actually talking about. So an example would be Elon Musk, who's been very successful in the business environment, and a couple of very successful businesses he's put together and run. And he came out with some tweets recently offering solutions to the Russia-Ukraine war, and they were incredibly simplistic and not really practical. And a bunch of people that are knowledgeable on those topics just crucified him, saying, to use a very popular phrase from a couple of years ago, just stay in your lane. Just because you're smart doesn't mean that you have good ideas on everything.
Well, I don't know. I mean, to me, the authority, it's an appeal to authority. So, for example, you might say, well, you can't argue with me on this because I know more about it. One example might be, or just an appeal to an authority that people don't agree with. So, for example, if you and I were arguing, and I quoted scripture, or said that God doesn't want us to do that, it doesn't really, for me, it works. For you, it doesn't. So it doesn't further our argument in any way.
Sure.
Because I'm making an appeal to an authority that doesn't really hold water with you. So I don't make those arguments because it would be pointless for us to do that in our conversations. I think, but sometimes it is difficult, and I think you'll sometimes see this when, well, you need to trust the science, you need to trust the scientists or whatever. I mean, sometimes scientists are wrong. I think that's so. So when you talked about with Elon Musk, I mean, you could look at it two different ways. I mean, the authority bias is, well, people who are more expert in this, they're the ones that know, so you shouldn't disagree with them. But if you're not going to appeal to authority, you would say, well, let's look at the argument based on its merits, not based on who's telling us what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I do feel that if someone has many years of experience in a particular field, they're going to, just by that very nature, have a lot more, I guess, to be redundant, authority to speak on that particular subject. Now, that doesn't mean that they're always going to be right. But I do feel that if you have, let's say, a neurosurgeon and a mechanic, and they're arguing, let's say, about mechanical stuff, well, the mechanic is going to have better information, and if they have two different opinions, I'm more likely going to listen to the mechanic than I am the neurosurgeon. Now, that doesn't mean that the mechanic's going to be correct, because everyone makes mistakes. But I feel like the authority that they have based on their experience does provide a little more value to the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the appeal to authority is, I mean, I think what you're saying is probably accurate, but the problem with the appeal to authority is, for example, if we were talking about foreign policy and we brought in George Bush and Dick Cheney, what would your thoughts be on listening to them?
Yeah.
So, and so many times, the other problem with an appeal to authority is there are authority figures or experts in the field that disagree with each other.
Yes.
And so, many times we're saying, well, you need to listen to this guy because he's a doctor. Well, I found this other doctor that says something different. Or, that it should be, I'm not going to say we're not going to appeal to authority in the sense that, hey, let's look at studies, let's look at data that's been provided by people that really know about this field. But it doesn't mean that we say, okay, because an authority figure or an expert says something that we have to agree with it. We have to look at the argument based on its merits and not just who's presenting the argument.
Yeah, I mean, you are correct, and it is one of the things about political conversation, even conversations about the economy, about the society, is that we all have opinions, and so it becomes a little bit more of a complicated conversation to have when you have, let's say, a sociologist or an economist, and they have a suggestion on something, but I've got my own opinion because of, well, my own life. Now, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. I could change my mind based on what they say, but given what we talked about before about about the confirmation bias, I might be a little more reluctant to, even if they are a Nobel Prize winning economist in their field.
Well, Brian, I mean, that's the authority bias is, I mean, that's what it is saying just because an authority has said it doesn't mean we should agree with it.
Right.
And if you're going to appeal to authority, it's not really helpful. I mean, it can be helpful, like that we should look at those people, but we can't just say, well, this person said it, so it's true. If we have counter arguments, then we should discuss those counter arguments, I guess is the point of that. That's what the bias is appealing too much to authority about and appealing too much to people and just assuming that because they're experts in the field that we have to agree with them.
Yeah, we can call this one like the parent's bias. We do it this way because I said so. And that's the end of it. I have the authority, therefore we just do it my way. And the child has no say in the matter, but really. Another one is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a very, very popular one. Everyone likes to talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know, the more confident you are. And I think that's a bit of an oversimplification, but there is, and of course, this comes, if I recall, maybe you have more information on it. There was a study where they found the more that people had, the more information, the more knowledge people had on a subject, the more likely they were to not get so confident in their statements. Do you know anything about it?
This one's confusing to me because I think that is true that sometimes we don't have as much information about something and we just make a statement. Yeah, the example they give is a good one. I don't see why we can't just print more money to pay the debt down, which there's all sorts of reasons why we don't do that, which we're seeing right now with inflation. But the other side of it is I think there's a tendency, and maybe we'll get to this one, that once people gain some information, the confirmation bias takes them to a point where they're just saying, well, now I'm, they don't come out and say that they're an expert, but they're essentially feeling like, well, I'm an expert on this because I've looked into it. So I'm not changing my viewpoint because I have some information. So I don't know, these two, there's a little bit of dissonance between the Dunning-Kruger effect and then the fact that many times when people get some information about something, they're not an expert, but they consider themselves an expert because they know just a little bit about it.
Yeah, and this one I think was very popular in the last couple of years, where people are doing their quote unquote research on YouTube video or in YouTube videos, learning about all sorts of things like immunology and the Constitution, and then feeling like that they're in a position where they can get onto the social media and start to educate people on everything that's wrong in our society from the basis of those two and others as well, of course.
Now, just be careful, Brian, because that's kind of what you and I are doing.
Yeah, we are. That's a very, very valid point. Very true. Yeah. All right. So then we have availability cascade. This is a really interesting one, that the more an idea spreads, the more valid it appears, or people take it to be. The more you hear people saying, "Oh, I heard this thing; it must be true." This is one that has been. I think there's certain people that really use this as the basis for their arguments. I don't want to call it any names in particular, but that the more that even if they start the rumor and then it starts to come back to them from other people, that seems to them to be confirmation that the rumor is true.
Yeah, I mean, the stolen election, I think, is one that comes to mind. That if you say it enough, then people start to believe it. I think, these ideas about inflation that people were saying at first, it was like, no, 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 it's not happening, it's not happening. And then, well, it's just the greedy business owners that are causing all these types of things, and people say it, and it gets said more and more often, and then people start to believe it because they've seen it so many times on the news or other places.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens on both sides equally, where both people just tend to these ideas get repeated loudly, and then of a sudden it's really hard to kind of contradict them. I think it's happened. I can think of a lot of examples, many of them very charged examples, so I probably won't get into them, but yeah, I can think of a lot of them.
Yeah, and then another one is the halo effect. Our overall impression of a person influences how we feel and think about their character. Um, And I actually, if you look at the example below that they give, I think that she's too nice to be a good commander in chief. And we talked about how there's been a few people that have looked at particular presidential candidates and said, I'm going to vote for him because I wouldn't mind sitting down with him on my porch and having a cup of lemonade and a conversation with him, as if this is a basis for the presidency. Kind of the opposite of what they're talking about here. But I feel like that is a common reaction. I like them, therefore they would be good at the job.
Yeah, yeah, I think for politicians, this is definitely the case. I mean, um, yeah, I could think of a number of examples. For Donald Trump, you can think of examples in both ways.
Yes.
That people that support him, that influences what they think about his choices and everything else, and people that don't support him. I mean, nothing could. It's almost as if they're putting words in his mouth because they're so certain that he is that type of a person. So they see everything through that lens. Whether you're a supporter or a detractor of Trump, you see everything through the lens of who you think he is. And there's not a lot of, it's difficult to think clearly about him and just kind of sit back and say, well, maybe that was a stupid thing to say, or, not that, going to the extremes, that people seem to go with him. He's a great example, but it happens with a lot of politicians and celebrities, maybe Elon Musk even.
Sure. Yeah. And I think this is one where you see some of the inability for Congress to act. You could look at it as a halo effect. The bill that the opposite party is putting forward, even though I wanted that particular activity to go forward back when we were in power, now that they want to go and push this bill forward, I no longer want to vote for this thing. I'm going to go and do what I can to stop it and to kill it in its tracks.
Yeah.
All right. Declinism, romanticizing the past. Everything is heading towards chaos, anarchy, revolution.
Yeah, this one I've been thinking about a lot lately, Brian, because when growing up, you'd hear people saying these things about, oh, the kids these days, they don't know how to work. They're always saying those things, and they say it now. And I was thinking, and then you have these things that happen, like there seems to be an epidemic almost of anxiety and depression amongst young people. And they're doing things differently, of course. I mean, parents, of course, when society changes and there's more acceptance of gay rights, of transgenderism, or like those things are going to be difficult enough. But then as I was thinking about it, how crazy things are right now, I wonder what people thought though in the 60s about people, that all the drugs that were being done. I mean, the 70s as well, free love, it was just such a change. And it's difficult as I look back, because it's easy to say, well, I mean, I guess that was the same thing. Maybe it's more prevalent now. I don't know, but it does seem that we're always looking and saying like, oh, kids are just different. At work, we'll do it. I had a manager that was complaining about these kids. They just don't know how to work hard anymore. Like, I'm like, Joe, don't you think they're kind of like us? I mean, when we were 18, we weren't that great, right? He's like, no, no. I'm like, and by the way, we were probably some of the more functional 18-year-olds. I was kind of mostly thinking of him because I was not a functional 18-year-old. Like, we were probably, there's not like everybody when we were 18 worked as hard as we did or even had jobs. Like, we were kind of a mess, and they had to teach us how to show up on time and how to address customers. Like, it's just part of the deal, right? Like, they're just like we were back then, and we just have to work with them. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think what were the 50s, 60s, 70s like as compared to today? Because today it's easy to look at it and be like, man, it is a crazy time. But the 60s couldn't have been that normal either.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I think that we have our personal experience, and then we have the experiences that we read about or see on TV, and you're always going to give more weight to something that you experience. Having a conversation recently with someone about, some people are looking at this as like the end times, as prophesied in the Bible. Well, you want to go back to when people really thought the end times were happening? Go back to the year 665. I mean, the next year, that was the year of the devil. I mean, it was coming. It was going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
How could you argue against that? It was so obvious. And then, of course, the year 667 comes along, and it's like, oh, well, we missed it. But then the year 1665, same thing happened. In Europe, they're all thinking, all right, here we go. It's a coming. This is the big time. And then it passes. And then we had Y2K. Again, nothing really happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, maybe what we're experiencing isn't as bad by comparison, but no one would know except for those that are experiencing it.
And you said it's what we've experienced, but I wonder if it isn't also what do we call it? The availability. Um, can you scroll up a little bit? Yeah, the availability bias, because, we see these crazy things happening with young people or these crazy things going on. And oh my gosh, the society's changing so quickly. But really, that's just a small vocal group of people on social media or in the news. And so we think this availability cascade that all this stuff is happening, but really it's just not that frequent. And it's
Right.
not that dissimilar to what was happening 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah, I heard that recently that the phrase "kids these days just don't want to work." That phrase was first used in print 100 years ago, so it's not a new
Hmm.
concept.
Yeah.
The framing effect. We draw different conclusions based on how an idea is presented to us. And this is what I was mentioning a moment ago. This is related to what was the other one? The coverage bias, where if you have one bit of information and you follow it up with another, that we tend to associate the two together. And so how you present the information can impact how we react to the information.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And I think this is one of the easiest ways to spot bias in the media. You and I mean, not to rehash a previous argument, but when we were talking about that Rand Paul issue with him trying to raise money for Tennessee, or where is that where he's from? Tennessee, I think.
Kentucky.
Um, what's that? Oh,
Kentucky.
Kentucky. Yeah, Kentucky. And they, the new. It took us a few news stories to find out what his viewpoint really was, and then the headline was very different from what he was trying to present. Now we might disagree with it or disprove it, but they're not presenting it in a way that allows people to think about it in an unbiased manner. I mean, if you look at a right-leaning news organization, you'll see everything skewed in one direction, but
Mm-hmm.
framed in a certain way. You look at the other side, you'll see it framed in the opposite way. In fact, they'll go so far as, if it's something bad about Trump, maybe the right-wing news organizations don't even cover it, And so that framing of things, it would be so difficult as a news reporter or an editor to put things in, to present things in a way that, make it sound or that make it unbiased, or don't frame it in a certain way, but just allow people to make their own decisions.
Yeah.
Do you just call it out like, well, he's lying in this case? Or do you say, he's, I don't know. Lying is such a charged word. So even using a word like that can be a way to frame an argument to say, well, this is, it kind of it goes to this conclusion already that he's been dishonest when some people might disagree. If I'm being clear on that one.
Yes, you are. Yep. Yeah, you're right. The next one is a funny one because the groupthink, conforming to a widely held worldview in order to fit in. My first reaction to it was that no, that's not happening, that we're actually more confrontational than ever. But then I thought more about it. And I think that as a group, we're confrontational, but we have little subgroups that we get very loyal to. And I think that's where the groupthink starts to happen. If you have a group of people that, let's say, that you're passionate about, you're about hunting, and with a group of other hunters, and that can sort of evolve into a whole Second Amendment conversation as well. And the assumption is, well, everyone feels the same way about the Second Amendment, about the right to bear arms, and now you're feeling, well, I like this group of people, I like what we're about, but I'm really not so, don't feel so strongly about it, but I'm just going to pretend that I do in order to not rock the boat or have them look at me in a way that I would rather they didn't.
Well, and I would imagine, Brian, it's much less conscious than that, that for the most part, people don't even realize that they're choosing teams. It's so embedded in who we are and in our DNA that they don't even realize that they're doing those types of things. Because, yeah, you definitely see that, and you see, you talk to somebody, you can almost see where they're getting you almost know where they're getting their information from pretty quickly. And what's interesting about it too is that we're so willing to do it in this country with only two political parties.
Right.
You'd think there'd be a lot more of people saying, well, I tend to vote Republican, but man, I struggle on some of the issues. But we just have two political parties, and people so quickly and easily fit into those two groups.
Yeah, you're right, and I think it's very true that now we feel we can't deviate in any way, or we're somehow disloyal, or the people that we want to like us. Yeah, it's interesting. It's especially interesting when it's subconscious. The false consensus, overestimating the portion of people that agree with an idea. Really funny experience I had with this one was talking to someone. This was back when George Bush was running for his second term, and the person was saying, there's no way he's going to win. Everyone's against it. All the news that I'm watching is against it. It's not going to happen. Turns out they were living in San Francisco. So yeah, everyone that they knew was from San Francisco, who was incredibly liberal. Of course, George Bush is not going to win. All the news she was getting was from San Francisco, very liberal. Yeah, he's not going to win, but of course he won.
Well, it was just so amazing to watch the Trump election. I didn't watch all of the news coverage, but they were just so certain that Hillary was going to win.
Yeah.
For hours. And then when, and who knows, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. I mean, frankly, I thought there was no way he was going to win because of everything that people were saying about it. And then you look back and people are saying, well, there was a lot of information showing that he had a good chance, but everybody made it sound like it was an impossibility that he would win. Right. And that wasn't just San Francisco. That was the whole country. I didn't even feel like there were a lot of right-leaning organizations or people that thought he was going to win. It was really just baffling how, when that happened, I was just so blown away.
Yeah, and I think that people are starting to acknowledge that they've got real problems with the way that they do the polling, that because people aren't answering the phones, and the phone has been the primary method of reaching people, and so they're having trouble getting an accurate representation. At least that's the explanation that I've heard. Maybe there's another explanation why the polling is always so far off. But at some point, hopefully they'll start to figure it out. Otherwise, we have no predictions. Maybe that's better. Maybe it's better not to be able to predict which way it might go.
It probably skews things. And I wonder how much the halo effect plays into that one, where people are just so certain that that he wasn't presidential, that he's such a horrible person, that they couldn't even conceive of a world where he would win the election.
Yeah.
So they couldn't report on it or look at it. I mean, when you looked back at the numbers, it sounded so certain, but when you really looked at the percentages, it was like within just a few points of each other. It doesn't even give room for some standard error.
Yeah.
Standard error.
If you're in the margin of error, it's not really accurate.
Hmm.
We only have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to talk just a little bit about the hierarchy of scientific evidence because I was, I don't know, I had this linked as well, and I don't know if you got a chance to see this one, but it was basically saying that not all information is equal, and that there's different types of information that is more valuable, more useful than others. And of course, I'll link to this one as well. But this is comes from originally from like medicine and from scientific studies, and so not all of it applies to what it is that we do, but you can sort of extrapolate out the more the harder or the more difficult it is to distort, to change, to allow bias into the arguments, that the uh, it impacts whether it's a valid argument or not. And what's as interesting is what they call the lack. There's the hierarchy of scientific evidence, and then there's no scientific evidence. And in that category, we have YouTube videos, personal anecdotes, gut feelings, parental instincts, some guy and it goes on through all the funny ways that we look at uh, information. And it does bring up the point of when we get information, we should try at least to honestly look at and ask ourselves, how valid is that information?
Well, and I would distinguish a little bit further. You said some things like YouTube videos or I don't remember parental advice or something like that. But I mean, if the YouTube video is referencing a good study, I think that would be fine. It's only when it's not like if you're having a discussion, a YouTube video is fine if it just depends on where they're getting their information from. And same with parents, like what are they referencing? Where do they get their information from? Those types of things I think are just as important.
That's a valid point. The source may have good sources, and so
Mhm.
you might have to go back a step or two to find out where they're getting the information, in order to consider whether it's valid or more valid or less valid than anything else that we're talking about. Um, yeah. Now I pulled us off screen because I wanted to see how much time we have left. We only got a few more minutes. Let me pull it back again so I can get exactly. We got yeah, just 2.5 minutes left. So based on that stuff, was there anything that you wanted to add, that you felt like we should include in this topic?
I guess as always, you probably want to talk about correlation versus causation. That if it's difficult to prove in any type of a study that that one factor causes another factor. Um, you know, and I can't think of good examples right now, but many times two things are correlated, but they might even it might not be that one causes the other, if that makes sense.
Vaccines
So,
cause autism. There's one.
yeah. Well, are you saying that they're correlated or
Well,
something?
that was the argument that was made, and then because the big explosion in the number of vaccines that were being given out happened at the same time that autism really popped onto the
Um,
scene as well. So the assumption was correlation, therefore causation.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good example. So, yeah, I think we need to be careful about those types of things. And I think many, even social scientists, get confused or are trying to, are not very successful at really understanding the difference, or ascribing, so sometimes they think it's causation, but it's really just correlation. So, I think that's an important one to look at. Yeah, really understanding studies and statistical, being able to have some statistical knowledge in your toolkit to be able to look at a particular study, because some of them they're not equal,
Right.
and some of them aren't as powerful as others. So yeah, I think that's a big one.
And we just have a few seconds left, but I thought one of the things I think that is really important is to be able to sit back and look at ourselves and our own opinions, and where we might be falling into some of these traps. Because it's easy to look at when, let's say, the media is making a mistake, but it can be harder when we're doing it to see it for ourselves, to look in that mirror. So,
Hmm.
anything in the last 30 seconds you want to throw out?
Maybe the next time we could list each of the times that the other person has fallen victim to these biases.
I don't like that idea at all. No, I don't want to do that. All right, Colin, a little more civil than it has been recently, so I enjoyed that one.
Okay. Yeah, me too, Brian.
Talk to you later.
See ya.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.